Great pleasure to be here, and for the first time, not in listening mode. I thought it was the suitable platform to discuss such an interesting topic. In fact, I was quite surprised that so far in my life, I don't think I've been in a forum that discussed smallness. Even though we come across it in various forms, in various opportunities, in various situations, throughout the courses of both our careers or beyond. And of course, I recognize that you yourselves have fairly disparate backgrounds. You come from different walks of life. But possibly one thing that unites us here in this room is the fact that you live in Malta. Perhaps you are Maltese. So obviously, I would say invariably, you would be in a situation where you would have had to confront the fact that Malta is a pretty small place, and that we all share this planet of ours, which is not exactly the center of the universe, as we probably all realize by now. So this is the gist of the presentation. Smallness is a way of life for most of us, or all of us. It interacts, it impinges on our behavior, on our way of thinking in multiple ways. And I think it deserves some critical reflections. As I do so, of course, you're going to have to pardon me, because smallness, in a way, is the theme, is the strand that connects some of my own different interests and career progression. It's quite uncanny that when I was thinking about this presentation, I realized that I spent around 20 years of my adult life working to live. I wasn't really keenly interested in my work, but I was completely passionate about astronomy, totally passionate about astronomy. And I learned a lot through my astronomical efforts, and I'm grateful for the friends that I made in those days, some of whom are in this room. So it was an effort that put me in touch with a certain number of people, and it was an effort that also made me connect with some of the smallest particles in the known material universe. Then at around the year 2000, year of the millennium, we didn't just change into the 21st century. Godfrey Baldacchino also changed. I had to take a very important decision. Astronomy was becoming a bit of a burden. I was getting very tired doing what I was doing, and of course juggling work with that pursuit. So I unfortunately decided I had to switch tacks. And I shifted more of my attention to my work. And from those days onwards, so for the past 25 years or so, I've been more involved in non-astronomical work, particularly work relating to workers and their organization. So by that I mean mainly trade unions and worker cooperatives, but also the study of islands and the study of small states. Of course, islands and small states. It's all right. Good evening. Malta is both an archipelago as well as a small jurisdiction, a small country. So my identity as a Maltese fits very well with this concern. I'm sure what I'm saying resonates with some of you. The pursuit of smallness may be something incidental, maybe something even spurious, perhaps, something that you might consider not important at all. I would beg to differ. I would say that irrespective of what you do, if you live in Malta, if you are Maltese, you need to confront this somehow. And after 64 years on this planet, I've reached the age of that famous Beatles song. You know what I mean? I think it's useful to reflect and reconsider perhaps the way in which smallness has infected my life and the way in which perhaps through me it has infected yours. And that includes stints that we spend abroad. Now, as I said in my introduction, this reflection is a fairly wide in terms of span of time. Together with colleagues, some of whom are in the room, as I said, I've been building a repertoire of studies, publications over the years, many of which I realize deal with pretty small things. Starting with meteors, strangely enough, sometimes referred to in the popular jargon as shooting stars. Nobody's shooting anything, and please, they are not stars. It's a common misconception. I remember I once had a teacher who was telling us in class, every time you see a shooting star, millions of people are dying. We are so lucky we're still here. Oh my God. It's not that. It's not like that at all. Anyway, so Meteor Observer's Handbook. I brought a copy here for anybody who would like to take a look. This is 1980, as you can see. Saint Meteors is a publication based on the study of what is probably the most popular meteor shower, annual meteor shower, the Perseid meteor shower, also called the Tears of St. Lawrence. You may know why. 10th August, thank you. So the climax is reached around the 10th of August, which happens to be the feast of St. Lawrence. And then moving, of course, to more contemporary work, my most recent book, The Success of Small States in International Relations, copy here, and a little sneak preview, one of my next books, a collaborative effort with Daniel Cilia, the photographer, where we are looking at the islands of Malta. Okay. But beyond Malta, Gozo, and Comino. There are 30 named islands, and rocks around the Maltese islands. So we're focusing on their fauna, their flora, their geology, etc., and how they have changed through time, because I think they're super interesting. So that's a little kind of a quick preview of the breadth of publications. I also brought with me a printed list of the publications that I have produced over the years. These are the official books and monographs. There are 37 of those. I didn't put in the commissioned reports and consultancies. That's not useful for the purpose of this presentation. One of my favorite slides, especially when I go abroad, I like to remind people that this is my country. It's not part of my country. It is my country, that's it. I mean, the only thing that's missing there is Filfla, right? Otherwise, it's all there. And at first, of course, people will just look. If you don't have a sense of scale, it's completely useless. I mean, that could be Greenland, or it could be Australia. Brian? It could be Australia. But I'm not sure whether there's a laser pointer here. What I then usually do is I identify the runway. Okay, exactly. And that's exactly what happens, right? People start laughing because they realize, okay, oh my gosh, you know, is this a country? How can it be a country? The country is 8 runways long. That's what it is.
I used to travel every day to go to work in Australia. The length of the country.
Yes, yes. And if you're on a motorway, and if you're doing what, 80 miles an hour, you will do Malta in 20 minutes, right? That's the length of time you take on a motorway without a traffic jam. So this is the size of the country, but it is a country. And this is also something we need to keep in mind. Just because it's small doesn't mean that it lacks elements of countryness. Can I use that word? Countryness, the essence of being a country. It has everything that you associate with a country. Everything. Everything, right? There is an expression, small country, ABC, articulation by compression. So it's all there, all very articulated, even at an intensely personal level. It's hyper-personal, as we know, right? It's impossible to avoid networks and entanglements with people that you know or people who want to know you. And yet, It has all the elements of a country. I think it's a very important point to make. And it's a country. Part of the reason why it is a country is because of Grand Harbor. Don't underestimate the importance of Grand Harbor in the history of this place. Especially if you're comparing Malta to places like Lampedusa, Pantelleria. None of those places has a natural harbor. Right. So back to smallness, but smallness in a different sense. I told you I've been fascinated by astronomy. I still remember 1969, I was 9 years old, looking out of the window from my aunt's house in Cospicua, looking at the moon and trying to see the lunar module on the surface of the moon, landing. I was 9 years old. And of course, I think that the space program has had a certain effect on how people look at their world. And I don't mean just photographically. I mean even psychologically, conceptually, philosophically. It may be a contradiction, but in a way, the more we've reached out to the moon, to the planets, we have now probes that are at the limits of our solar system. The more we have reached out, some of the most iconic photographs that we have taken of space are not just about the galaxies and the double stars and the clusters, etc., that are out there. Some of the most iconic photographs are actually about our planet. And I think there are a few that have captured the imagination. One of them is this, taken by sheer coincidence, by the way. Lunar module heading towards the moon, okay? Impossible to take a photo of the Earth because it's behind. But as the lunar module is turning to land on the moon, there's this window of possibility captured by astronaut William Anders to take a photo of the Earth. There it is, called Earthrise. I mean, the foreground shows the lunar surface, right? And it also allows a little comparison as well between the bleak, airless, lifeless landscape of the moon and, well, a planet that is, of course, teeming with life. But at the same time, surrounded by blackness, the void of space. So it's about, well, it's our home. At the same time, it's surrounded by, well, emptiness. It is what it is. Another iconic photograph taken at the end of the Apollo program this time. This is Apollo 17. You would know, of course, that there are plans to return people to the surface of the moon. This is the blue marble. This is the photo. I'm afraid it's a little bit skewed there, my fault. It's one of the rare full Earth photos of the Earth. So no part of the Earth there is in shadow. The whole disk is seen. And what's also interesting, of course, two other interesting details. The ratio of land to sea in this photo is pretty accurate. So it reflects the way in which the ratio of land to sea is 19:81. That's the percentage distribution of land to sea on planet Earth, so-called planet Earth. Secondly, it doesn't show either the United States or Europe. Again, to remind us that there are other parts of the world that they are not usually in the limelight, in the spotlight. That's another one of those great photos. And then this. I think this was a fantastic photo of the Earth, taken again years later. This time it's 1990, not taken by human hand. This is Voyager 1, 6 billion kilometers away from Earth, having traveled for decades out of the solar system, and managing to turn around and try to capture an image of the Earth. Can you see it? Can you see it? That's it. If you can't see it, I assure you it's there. It's the red dot. It's an image that has also inspired the book by the same name by Carl Sagan, right? The speck. The light bands are a result of the image being taken in the vicinity of the sun. So that's why they are part of the photograph. And this kind of image conjures different reactions. Insignificance. And yet, it's all there. It's one of those contradictions, right? It's nothing, and at the same time, it's everything. Prior to or parallel to the space age, we have also had other people commenting, writing, reminiscing, reflecting about smallness. They come from different disciplines. A book that celebrated 50 years of publication last year, pretty influential in its time, also associated with the Green Movement. It's Fritz Schumacher's Small is Beautiful, a study of economics as if people mattered. This is an attempt by an economist to try to bring in the human factor into the discussion of the dismal science. It's also an attempt, chapter 5 in particular, chapter 5 is called The Question of Size. And Schumacher argues, remember, this is 1973, that there is an ideal state size. He's arguing from an economic point of view. You need some population, etc., in order to have some economies of scale, because otherwise you are operating at a disadvantage. But at a certain point in time, you get diseconomies of largeness kicking in as well. So he argues that a state of the right size should have a population of approximately 5 million, he says. Interesting. We'll come back to that later. Mark Granovetter, American sociologist, social psychologist, he reminds us, and I think it's worth thinking about this, and it's one of the takeaways probably from this evening, that there are many small things. Usually, when you have a population, the majority of things are small. Not always. Right. For example, demographically, we are looking at a completely different situation these days. We are maximizing the number of old people, and we are looking at diminishing the number of children. I know there are people interested in children in this room, right? They're becoming a scarce resource. There are more cats and dogs now in our families than there are kids. And I'm not just talking about Malta. But that's the exception. By and large, when we talk about things, whatever they are, material things, and they come in different sizes, usually you have a few large items, but progressively more smaller items. So we are certainly not short of examples. We are certainly not short of the potential for comparative work, comparative inquiry. And yet, in practice, this is hard to come by. Why? Because very often we prefer large, small comparisons, which make no sense. They make sense as case studies, independent case studies. But how can you explain or compare or get good practice for a small country when you're looking at a large one? There are certain things that don't compute. One of the smallest items certainly in the solar system are, let's call them dust particles. Not shooting stars. But yeah, we can call them shooting stars if you prefer. They're more romantic like that. But they only become shooting stars in a certain phase of their life, remember. So they are dust particles. In their stable state, we call them meteoroids. Okay? But when they enter the atmosphere, and we see them flickering in their moment of destruction, we call them meteors, right? If they are large enough to survive their journey through the atmosphere and they land on Earth, then they become meteorites. Okay? That is the difference between the three words. The origin of meteors, well, now we know fair amount of information and knowledge about them. Their origin is typically either from comets or from asteroids. And they have allowed us to understand some of the dynamics of the solar system, both now but also in the past. So there's a considerable amount of theoretical work based on the observations of thousands of people. This is not something that you pay someone to do. Okay? This is based mainly on voluntary work. People spending hours looking at the sky and then registering, recording what they see. Plotting, sometimes, positions on a map, identifying the time, identifying the color, if there's a color, identifying the magnitude, the brightness of the object, etc. And then, of course, combining all that data together, sometimes on a planetary scale, in order to come up with fairly sophisticated analysis of meteor showers. This is some of the work that some of us in this room have done painstakingly over the years. Today, of course, we have a big challenge here. It's the challenge of progress, right? Light pollution. This has become the big challenge these days. Today, for example, from my house, it is impossible to see even some of the so-called bright stars because there's so much light pollution in the street that that legacy is gone. Yes, you may notice that when you draw the lines of those trails backwards, they seem to come from a certain point. This is it's a matter of perspective. They're actually moving in parallel lines, okay? They're not diverging like that. They're actually moving in parallel lines, but they appear to diverge from a point, to radiate from a point, which in fact is called the radiant. Right. I couldn't resist putting in some photos here. Of course, black and white. Some familiar faces. The opportunity to observe meteors during a week, for example, in Gozo or Einthoven, is a very, very bonding experience. You build your friendship network, and you also build your skills, your organizational skills, your analytical skills, your leadership skills, your talking skills when you have to deliver lectures to your colleagues, right? Yozan, Leslie, Tony, etc. Yeah. The photo taken in the top right, that's the photo on the site of the current Germa Palace Hotel. That was before the Germa Palace was built. Okay. Yeah. And, well, talking about invisibility and the question that was raised by our good friend there at the back earlier, you have to explain where you come from. Imagine trying to explain where you come from to somebody who may not even know that your country exists or your island exists. Let's start with the image on the right. I sent this to Evarist some months ago. I was in Prague. I mean, not a marginal airport in Europe, right? Prague is the capital of the Czech Republic, right? And, I mean, you can go and check if you don't believe me. The departures lounge has a map of the world on the floor, and there's no Malta.
And no Maltese has drawn it in?
So far. Well, if they have done, presumably they've washed it away, right? I guess they clean that place at least once a day. So it's not there. It's not there. And big fuss in Canada. As you have heard, even in my introduction, my wife and Diana and our younger son, we spent 10 years living full-time there, working there. And Prince Edward Island is Canada's smallest province. It is small, yes, 150,000 people, half the size of Sicily, very small by Canadian standards. But it is a province, like Quebec, like Ontario, like British Columbia. And of course, it has to be respected as a province. So you can imagine what happened when somebody published those copybooks that have completely omitted Prince Edward Island. The publisher had to take everything back and reprint because it doesn't go. I mean, should we do the same thing with Prague, force them to tear up the floor and do it again, or at least change that tile in the middle? It's not a bad idea. Yes. Talking about small states, I think it's inevitable we need to have a discussion also about this whole business of what are small states. Is Malta a small state? I remember my rector was very happy. We once were invited to a meeting in Andorra for the setting up of a network of universities of small states and territories. And the universities that were there were the University of Andorra, the University of San Marino, the University of Liechtenstein, and the University of Malta. And my rector told me, Godfrey, do you realize how important this meeting is? For the first time, we are the biggest players here. Yeah, well, I told him, yeah, relish the moment. It's one of those rare situations where, yes, we are indeed sometimes, okay. We're not small, but yeah, sometimes we can play the big boss as well, the big game. I think it's also important to note that where small states have a seat at the table, whether it's Council of Ministers, I don't know, any forum where small states participate as fully fledged members, so they have a voice, size doesn't necessarily matter anymore. If you have an argument, if you have a valid argument, if you can talk properly, tactfully, bring up the right examples, make the right point, your argument can still carry the day. The guy with the red tie is a guy called Tony de Brum. He was the representative of the Marshall Islands at the International Maritime Organization. I'm saying was because unfortunately he passed away. But thanks to him, the Marshall Islands, which by the way, for those of you who may not know, also have, like Malta, a very large ship register. Okay? They transformed the International Maritime or the IMO Technical Committee. Antoine would know probably about this. There was a technical committee about standards. It had been taken over by technocrats, so they were discussing minor details. This guy comes in, and he basically convinces the rest of the committee we have to do something about climate change. Ships are a contributor to climate change. We should move towards a zero carbon strategy in shipping. Oh my gosh. So you can imagine, right? Now, the IMO has very stringent standards for vessels, which oblige now practically all the vessels in the world to move towards a zero carbon technology. One man. And when you look at the photo, of course, you don't spot the small state. He's a man like other men. Okay, there are some women as well, of course, so it's not just a story of one man. It could be a story of one woman. I think this is one of the important lessons that we need to take with us when we find ourselves in situations where we have a voice. Indeed, we may start off with an advantage because sometimes our audience doesn't expect much from us. And this plays to our strengths. This is certainly to our advantage. I don't know about you. I have been to various international fora where you start by people ignoring you, You're not important. Then you make your point, you make your presentation, and then suddenly people start looking at you. Right. Yes, and the whole business of the relationship between identity, geography, and diplomacy is, I think, a very, very important point as well to keep in mind. We have an obvious affiliation with other islands and small states. We come with certain advantages. We have the world's largest and oldest small state university, for example. Nobody beats us there. So we have huge opportunities for diplomacy that is related to human resource development. And I think we're doing that. We're doing that better than we used to in the past, but there's still huge opportunities to do that even more in certain technical and specialized fields in particular. Yes. I told you as well, one of my professional interests in life has been following the rise and fall, I must say, of trade unions in Malta. The latest statistics are not exactly, they don't make for pleasant reading. The proportion of Maltese workers who are unionized in the private sector in Malta has gone really down. Public sector, no problem. Practically everybody is, whether they like it or not, they are involved in a trade union and they have collective bargaining at a national level, etc., with the state. But in the private sector, the situation is really heading towards an absence of trade unions. And you will see there's not one trade union. There are more than one. And therefore, part of the discussion, part of the reflection that needs to be made here is when you have somebody as small as an employee, what is it that prevents that employee from realizing that the only or the main form of strength that that person has is by ganging up with other employees and trying to argue from a position of collective strength? Not only is this not happening, but even the trade union movement, of course, is fragmented. There are now at least 3 trade union so-called confederations or bodies which don't necessarily work hand in hand. We could use the same argument for cooperatives. The cooperative movement in Malta started off mainly in the agricultural and fisheries sectors. It has now branched out into all sectors of the economy. There are also quite a large number of so-called worker cooperatives where the members are actually people employed in the organization. But it represents less than, can I say, 1% of registered companies, probably even less than 1%. David, you're the expert on companies. You've just published a book. And I'm having to attend your book launch on Tuesday next week, I believe, at the Malta Business Registry. So we are looking at situations where there are really small players, but at the same time, these small players are overwhelmed by pique, by rivalry, perhaps partisan divisions, lack of trust, people using the cooperative structure for other ends. There are so many computations there that oblige us to really try to find out more and be more critical about these units, these structures, and what they are supposed to accomplish. I remember my colleague Manuel De Bono back in 2015. Manuel works at the Center for Labor Studies, with which I have been associated for many years. We carried out a representative study of Maltese workers, and one of the questions was, are you a member of a trade union? Yes, no, etc. And for those who are not members of trade unions, the follow-up question was why? And part of the reason given by a substantial number is a bad experience with a trade union. Because again, when you associate yourself with an organization, okay, you have unity in strength. But at the same time, you are allowing yourself to be part of a larger structure. And what that larger structure does is not necessarily in agreement with what you think. Again, let us remind ourselves, the larger the structure, the more invariably political it becomes. And then, therefore, there are other interests. And now we come to islands, another interesting area that I have been involved with, particularly when in Canada. I was Canada Research Chair for Island Studies. And I was very lucky, I must say, a federally funded position with lots of room to maneuver, to dream, to carry out research, to identify colleagues from around the world. The edited book is my preferred form of publication because it allows me to develop a relationship with approximately 12, 15, 20 people over a period of approximately 2 to 3 years. So you really build a certain camaraderie and esprit de corps in that way. I told you I have many books, but I'm also pleased to say, to share with you that my best-selling book is actually edited by me and my wife. So I'm very pleased that we hit a winning collaboration, Anna, on this book. Of course, it's not our only collaboration, obviously. But we found a topic that I think is serious, but at the same time semi-popular, right? It's a book that describes 60 different recipes from the 60 different islands around the world. And it makes a great gift. It's published in Canada. So, yes. Talking about islands invariably makes you talk about size. In fact, very often when people say islands, they don't have Madagascar in mind, they don't have New Guinea in mind, they don't have Greenland in mind, right? They usually have smaller places in mind. So it's a very interesting field because it reminds us also of how Malta is not an island, an archipelago. It reminds us how there are many parts of the world that have islands. There are many states that are only islands, and there are many states that have islands. And islands come in all shapes and sizes. Some are river islands, some are lake islands, some are estuarine islands, delta islands. Some are so-called continental islands, close to the shore. Others are oceanic, far away. And then finally, of course, given the advances in engineering these days, we cannot exclude also artificial islands. If you've ever landed in Kansai in Japan, for example, Kansai is built on an artificial island, the airport, the whole airport. Singapore now, the new runway at Singapore airport is built on reclaimed territory, which has extended the size of that place. Justin is heading to Singapore for part of his PhD research. Yes, this is a map of the world showing the islands of the world. And as I said, most of them are continental. Most of the world's islands are very small. We are talking approximately 85,000 populated islands on the planet. And 650 million islanders, which is not a small number. So it's around 10% of the total population of the world. Out of those 650 million islanders, 100 million live on Java, 100 million live on Honshu, 60 million live in Britain, 40 million live in Luzon, and then of course it starts getting smaller and smaller and smaller, until we reach a situation where you may find one person 2 persons, Comino, 2 persons right now, right? Trying to survive on a small island. And there's a lot of romanticism as well about these places and how some of these places have had to shut down, and people now just visit them to see how these people used to live. Two main archipelagos on the planet. One is in Southeast Asia, Indonesia in particular, Malaysia, Papua New Guinea, Philippines, Singapore. You have about 400 million people living there by themselves, in that bottom right corner. And then the second largest archipelago is in the north of Canada, which, of course, is very sparsely populated. The largest town there, Iqaluit, has 7,000 people. The rest is permafrost and nomadic Inuits. Contrasting, very contrasting situations. Two of my colleagues, a Frenchman and a Swiss, have also come up with an idea of the number of islands that might exist. It's a huge number. And there are, of course, going to be always debates of where do we cut off, both at the top end and at the bottom end. Do we include the continents as islands, for example? Because from a strictly geographical point of view, the world's largest island is Eurasia, following the Suez Canal of the 1860s. It is Eurasia. It used to be Eurasia, Africa, as one landmass, not anymore. The other end of the spectrum creates also problems. Where do you draw the line? How small is the smallest island? If you have a pebble just jutting out of the surface of the water, is it an island? It may be an island for a small insect living on it, right? But so there's no cutoff point at the bottom, but I'm sure you agree with me, there are thousands and thousands of examples of small islands. We're not going to be running out of examples of islands, for sure. Yes. So back to states. You may remember the point I made about Schumacher in 1973. A state of the right size is approximately a state with 5 million people. Well, guess what? If you plot the world's countries by population, starting from the least populated to the most populated, now it's India, not China anymore. And you work out what is called the median, which is the country that is exactly in the middle, right? So there are 193 states in the world. If you look at the membership of the UN General Assembly, if you include the world's semi-autonomous territories, there are 238. It's not going to make a big difference because most of them are very small. The largest of those would be Puerto Rico, for instance. So you plot them, and then you identify the state which represents the median. So there are as many countries on one side of that line in the middle as there are to the other side. What would be the population of a state in that middle? And the answer is 5.3 million. The closest would be Finland. Anybody from Finland in this room? Okay. So we have the honor of being the most typical country on the planet.
The most typical or the most efficient or the most?
The most typical from a geographical point of view. Now, whether it's the most efficient, I don't know. Schumacher would be very happy. Unfortunately, he's dead. Right? But
Rich country. It's a rich country.
It's a fairly rich country, of course. Scandinavia, very high index on most counts, including environmental counts. Technology, environment, social welfare, right? Very beautiful place. Why am I saying this? Because sometimes we beat ourselves into thinking that because we are small, we are exotic, we are very different, we're not typical. But the small state is the typical state. We are the typical state. the exotic members of the family of nations are at the end. Okay, we have some very small countries. The Vatican, is it a country? I don't know. Monaco, what is it? A bunch of very rich people. Malta will be, okay, so this is a logarithmic scale. Mauritius is 1.3 million, Luxembourg is here, so it's somewhere here. Between Bahamas and Luxembourg. That's Malta. So it's 1/4 in a way up the scale. Not the smallest country in the world. Again, it depends how we measure smallness. This is again another important factor. How do we determine how small a country is? Some people would use population, in which case Malta is relatively high. There are dozens of countries that are smaller than our population. If we look at land size, however, we are the 10th smallest country in the world. There are only 9 smaller countries than us. And one of the challenges of the small country is to put itself as the center of attention. So instead of being marginalized, instead of being forgotten, rendered insignificant, we may want to turn the spotlight back on us. And today it seems that we have reached a stage where we could turn that spotlight back on us because of the advantages of smallness. Let's keep in mind that we are living in an age where there is a lot of money going around trying to encourage the transition to green, decarbonization, abandoning fossil fuels, right? Islands present themselves as very, very useful candidates for these experiments. Why? Because with less money, you can turn around an island in a faster time. And there are various islands that have and still are managing to live through this transition and at the same time turn it into a point of interest. So it also becomes a form of tourism. You have individuals who will go to visit certain countries in order to see how did you do it? How are you successful in making this transition? How did you turn your economy around? It's easier to do it when you have less people. It's easier to do it when you have a political economic elite that can be counted perhaps on one hand. It's also easier to do it when you don't start with a position of manufacturing. High levels of manufacturing activity that are typically polluting industries, right? It's so funny. When you see signs indicating, say, industrial estate, the sign usually indicates a factory with a chimney. I mean, how many chimneys do we have in Malta? Belching smoke. But that's the stereotype, right? Hopefully we are moving to a situation where there will be less smokestack industries in the world, but in Malta we don't start with a situation where we have to dismantle smokestack industries because they're not there. They weren't there in the first place. It's not economically viable to produce certain manufacturers in a place like Malta. You have to import everything, and then you have to export everything again. So this was last November during COP26 in Abu Dhabi. Am I correct? I think. So it was produced in order to highlight how small countries, especially islands, may be examples of good practice of how larger states may follow. And these are a few islands from different parts of the world that are doing their little bit in order to, help the planet, but at the same time help themselves, obviously. And I'm doing them a big favor by mentioning them here. Samsø in Denmark, which is not just a carbon neutral territory. It's also a carbon negative territory. They actually now send clean energy to the mainland. And they have also invested in a ferry that works with sustainable fuel. That's an idea for Gozo Channel, by the way. Ferries that work with sustainable fuel. Greece, the island of Astipalea. It's being used as an experiment in Greece for the complete 100% shift to electric vehicles. El Hierro in the Canary Islands in Spain. 100% renewable energy, mainly on the basis of wind. So wind turbines generate all the energy required to sustain the energy requirements of this island. And Japan has Ishigaki down in the prefecture of Okinawa, which is a nature park and where the islanders basically are working in tandem with the requirements of the park. It's something that may be a bit far-fetched elsewhere, but in Japan, believe me, it's quite possible, given the culture that they have. So my last two slides, and then I'll stop, trying to summarize some of the challenges associated with smallness. Number one, of course, not being visible. Starting from a position where you have to explain who you are, where you come from. At home, we have a collection of bottles called Malta. None of them come from Malta. Because there is a malt drink, and sometimes it's branded as Malta, but they come from the Caribbean, from Africa. None of them is Maltese. Lack of self-confidence. Somebody mentioned inferiority complex earlier, right? This idea that we have to prove ourselves sometimes even before opening our mouths. We start off with that disadvantage. It's the baggage that we carry. There's the inferiority complex. Low expectations from others, which then, of course, leads to surprises and awe and gaping when they realize that we could contribute, we could make a difference. And the risks associated with abuse, the risks associated with putting your eggs in the same basket as other small countries and seeing what happens. And I call this the Napoleon syndrome, not in the sense that you might think. It's not the Napoleon syndrome associated with short stature. It's the Napoleon syndrome of realizing the way the wind is blowing and going with the wind rather than with your morals. Napoleon betrayed his country, Corsica. He started off as being an independentist, and then he realized, nah, this is not going anywhere, and he switched sides. In fact, if you go to Corsica, Napoleon is not their hero at all. Their hero is Pascal Paoli, who set up their university and who tried to negotiate independence with the support of Britain. It didn't work. Finally, and by way of summary, of course, does geography matter? Let's start from there. I think it still does. I think it would be a shame to throw out of the window the whole business of materiality. Materiality still matters. How we behave as people is determined by our space, by the way in which we navigate and we construct the space around us. And that also includes smallness, right? So smallness, Emeritus Minister Bartolo earlier said, it's a frame of mind. Definitely a frame of mind. But it is associated with a physicality. It's not just something that exists in an abstract form. It's something that's associated with a material reality, but the consequences of that material reality are not given. This is it. It is people who make history. History doesn't just happen by itself. Secondly, it's psychological, definitely. And since we're talking about relationships, since we're talking about speaker, audience, it can affect both sides of the equation, right? It may affect me if I'm in an international audience and I need to prove myself, or I think I need to prove myself, or it has to do with an audience that wants me to justify somehow why I should at all be given the floor, since I'm coming from a country that some people would think doesn't even exist. Number 3, it's a fact of life, and we are not alone. Smallness is natural. It is normal. Indeed, I would argue it is the most common form of many objects. Majorities are small. It is relational, of course. There's nothing small unless there's something big, obviously, and that can change depending where you are, and it evokes different emotions, feeling small, feeling large, sometimes in the same venue, depending whom you're talking to or dealing with. It's microcosmic, just like islands telling us how the world can change, just like meteors perhaps, also telling us how the solar system may have been formed. They are windows onto other larger worlds. So the value of these small places, of small objects, isn't just the value that they have in and of themselves, it's also about how they give us messages, lessons about larger places. That's why we also use the word microcosmic. Okay? Plentiful, there are no shortage of examples in dealing with islands and dealing with small objects. They are strong when working together. Probably one of the best exponents of small states working together, for instance, is the Alliance of Small and Island States. It is the alliance that forged in the Paris Accord of 2015 a reference to a temperature target that unfortunately we are going to miss this year. Not to allow the planet to rise by more than 1.5 degrees Celsius beyond pre-industrial levels. Unfortunately, the data is already suggesting we are extremely close. I think the latest figures are 1.48 degrees already above pre-industrial levels. So we really are missing the bus here, in spite of all the pious talk about combating climate change. We are different. The small is not just a microcosmic representation of the big, which are Justin. They also have their own characteristics. They are articulated by compression. You don't just blow up a small object and presto, you have a large state. No, it is different. The way in which the public, the economic, the political are imbricated in and with each other are quite unique. The way in which it is more difficult to have radical ideas in a small place, for example, is quite unique. The way in which large populations from islands end up living and working elsewhere is also quite unique. The size of the diaspora in relation to small countries is huge, unlike larger states. Not to mention, of course, that when we talk about history in small places, it's usually history that's being impacted by what's coming from outside. And finally, significant. And we should never allow ourselves to be cowed into submission, into thinking that simply because we're coming from a small place, we are not of value. We are valuable, if anything, for ourselves, but even, as I have tried to suggest, because we can suggest lessons for other larger places. I think I've spoken quite a lot, and thank you for your attention.